We always say seat time is king, so sit on down and listen in to Motorsports Tech Talk with your hosts, Brian and Eric. Eric, how's it going?
Doing all right. One of those kind of productive weekends, kind of not, a lot of cleaning. I mounted one go-kart tire, so I know that's pretty impressive. Go ahead and stay seated for that by hand, which is a huge pain in the ass. You can go find YouTube videos of people like changing these tires by hand, and it's a complete fucking joke. I don't know how they make it look so easy, but as you can imagine, these baby ass tires that are slicks, so they're super fucking stiff, are real hard to rip off the wheel and shove another one on.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, and then I removed the steering isolator out of my daily because it felt to me as if it was going, as if, the isolator portion of that was just completely blown out. So I welded that solid. Kids at home, just don't listen to me, right? The steering system's a safety critical system. Don't go welding on it if you don't know what you're doing. But all of that said, I believe you had a much more action-packed and exciting weekend, right?
Yeah. First race to spec me out of season. I was able to get some help from my co-host over here to get my diff in the car.
Yeah, boy.
That was clutch. We were able to rebuild it, get it in there, finish the trans swap because most of the stuff that had to be done on the trans swap was mainly things that were in the way of the diff too, so just mainly waiting on the diff there, but got it all in, of course, left it all last minute, did the alignment, left at it was like 10 o'clock, 10:30, and then did the 7-hour drive. We gain an hour though, so it was effectively a 6-hour drive, although it's still 7 hours of driving. I got in at like 4:30 a.m. Luckily, I was running the practice day, so I got 2 hours of sleep and then just drove the practice day. I didn't crash into anything. Surprisingly, I definitely didn't feel sharp. Felt like I might not really pass out, but it was like everything was in slow motion except for it wasn't. So my hands were in slow motion, but but everything else was not. But got after the practice day, passed out at like 6:30 after we had dinner and just slept all the way till the next morning basically, and then I was all good to go for the races. So unfortunately I found that my new diff ratio actually didn't really help anything. If anything, it might have hurt, at least at this track. I seem to have, at least looking at the data, I lost 3 miles an hour, peak miles an hour on the straight, but
that's
part of that could...
that's a lot in a spec series with 0 horsepower.
Yeah, exactly. And in Miata, if you go 3 miles an hour faster in Miata, it's like, you should throw a party.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's a lot of extra speed. It's a higher percentage increase. When you're only going from like 90 miles an hour to 93, it's a bigger jump than 150 to 153, right?
Dude, I see pro drivers sweating a 2 kilometer an hour difference between some of them at the end of a straight. So, and those are like high horsepower cars. So that is actually huge.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of it did, the track didn't seem as grippy as it was in October. We had really good conditions in last year in October, enough for the track record to be set. So everyone was quite a bit slower this year, just a little slipperier. It was sunnier. The track definitely doesn't like to be hot. It likes a nice cool track there, at least, and really any track. But definitely was noticeable there. So the straight is preceded by a bunch of kind of S's. So if you don't get a good run through those, then you will have a slower end of straight speed. But it it seemed like it was though more engine related overall. So I mean my fastest lap was like 4/10 off of my previous fastest. Some of the guys up front were over a second slower, so maybe it was overall an improvement. If most people were going back a second to a second and a half, and I was only a few tenths back, but I don't know. It didn't seem. I didn't seem like I got any closer to kind of the front few guys. Yeah, the first race, I guess quick note. I last episode I said we were planning to live stream to our page. I wasn't able to. The internet there has been really spotty. Like last year, I was able to get one of the races to live stream, and I was hoping this year I have a new GoPro that I was going to try out versus the Yi action cam that I had, and I thought that might help because the GoPro app seemed a little nicer to deal with and everything. But it didn't. The GoPro was streaming, but it wasn't getting picked up on the YouTube side. So I just called it because I didn't want to struggle with it all weekend. So instead, I just made sure to get good recordings and everything, and then I'm gonna post them up this week as well. So keep an eye out for those. I'll send some links out, but basically, first race I started third. I qualified third for it, and I was able, after a caution period, I was able to get up to first for like half a lap, and then just kind of kept getting picked off on the straights. And then like I'd be put out of position through a corner, and then two guys would slip through like every time, basically, because everyone was so close. So ended up seventh there. That, I mean, I definitely felt like I could have done some better racecraft there, but that was a little disappointing. Ultimately, my goal was always to be in the tire money, as I say. Top 5 get Toyo bucks. So I was out of the tire money, so I was a little disappointed there. But then the next two, I finished 5th and 4th, so those were improvements and in the tire money, so I was happy with that. Just no podiums, which is a little, usually the last few events I've gotten at least one podium per kind of event, so a little upset that I felt like I was going a little backwards, but
Sure.
But yeah, that's just sometimes how it goes. It's racing, so
Right.
But it's definitely given me a lot of motivation to get my new spec me on engine in, so I can get a whole like 4 more horsepower or whatever it's going to be. But
Yeah.
but again,
I mean,
that's like a 10% increase in Miata horsepower.
yeah,
It's like
dude.
4 horsepower.
Might as well double it at that point. But
So
I mean, on the note of racing not always going the way you want it to, as well, right? A mutual friend of ours was also racing this past weekend, and they got second in class in their endurance race, and that's the 4th time. And they just keep having issues, whether it's someone runs out of fuel, and I tried to get a straight answer, and judging by the lack of response, I think it was a stupid mistake on the team's part rather than something with the car. But, I mean, it can be frustrating at times, when everything should work out for you and it doesn't, or you just don't do as well as you expected. I mean, I understand that feeling.
yeah, and like last year, I had it was kind of a very measured progression. Like I went from getting into the tire money, or not being out of the money, I guess you could say, and then getting into the tire money, and then getting my first podium, and then getting my first like double podium, and then getting my first win. So like it was a nice progression, and then now I kind of backslid into not getting a podium. But there were. I mean, there's a lot of cars there, and some guys that, of course, made improvements over the winter too, and so everyone else isn't just sitting by, letting me get by them or whatever. So
Right.
more competition's always good. So yeah, I just gotta step on my game. Um, there's definitely I can always drive better. More seat time's always gonna get me faster, and and always shaking off a little bit of that rust from the off season too.
Right.
But then on the car side, there's definitely some improvements I feel like I can make there. And the main thing right now, my main focus is the engine. So with that said, we thought we also would maybe talk a little bit about a kind of intro to engine building this week. It's something I have a passion for, although I haven't done enough of it to really call myself an expert. I have a lot of engines that need to be built. Just so maybe this will be a good refresher for me, and since I'll be doing it on the Miata the next few weeks, yeah, maybe based on how that goes, that we can do like a part 2 or something, go a little more nitty gritty. But
Yeah. Well, and I think
but
this is going to be focused on like blueprint based engine building, right?
yes,
We're not talking about your stroker kit, or a D-stroker high boost setup thing, right? This is
yeah, or picking which engine, or even going crazy and making custom the crankshafts and specing custom pistons or whatever, anything like that. It's going to be more whether it's a stock rebuild, which is effectively what a Spec Miata engine is, or kind of your performance rebuild with nice off the shelf pistons and rods and everything like that. But talking more about just the measurements you're going to want to take, the things you need to focus on, the tools you're going to need, kind of what to look out for with what tools you should get, and what's adequate, or where you can kind of go over the top and gain a lot of accuracy and precision. But yeah, I mean, it's something that I find that a lot of endurance racers aren't the best with for some reason, is building engines. At least in kind of the amateur, call it crap can kind of endurance stuff, where most of the time people are just getting an engine out of the junkyard, or just get an engine, slap it in there, run it.
Yeah.
Which
I mean, we know some
which
of
is
those
fine.
people.
Which is fine, but there's definitely a lot to be left on the table when you're throwing in a 160,000 mile engine and expecting it to have the power it was advertised at.
Yeah. 16 years ago.
Or expect it to perform just as well as the guy who did rebuild his engine and freshen it up. So it's like I said, endurance racers for some reason don't focus too much on it. It's something that drag racers, I'm sure, are always looking at, and I guess kind of similar to that time attack, basically drag racing, but at a circuit almost.
Yeah.
At least the engine builds are.
Yeah, I mean, they only
are
last
similar.
2 laps or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Same, pretty much.
But yeah, I mean, I guess I can just kind of go through all the different things to look out for, the different specs to measure, and how to measure them, and what kind of tools to get. So I guess we can start. Would you rather start from the top or the bottom?
Well, let's start with the bottom. Bottom end.
The bottom. Okay.
Yeah.
The bottom, of course.
Yeah.
So kind of your block and your crank.
Yep.
That's going to be, so your bottom end, as it's referred to. There's several different measurements here. Obviously, you have your bore, your cylinder bore, which isn't as simple as just, it's this size and you're done. There's a couple different things you have to look out for. So there's going to be a bore spec, obviously, depending on whether you're going with a stock bore or an overbore. So usually when you're rebuilding an engine, it's very rare for you to not be able to get it, or if you want the engine to be fresh and performing at its maximum, you usually need to do some sort of cylinder bore to kind of get the cylinder back into the correct shape. So basically over time, as you wear an engine, usually on the piston skirts, so kind of the I guess it's kind of along the axis of the crankshaft, the piston will rub against those sides of the cylinder walls. So the kind of longitudinal sides of the engine. At least I'm thinking of a 4-cylinder, but basically it's wherever the rod is rocking along that kind of plane. That's where it's going to rub on the cylinder walls, and then over time, basically, it's going to egg shape those cylinder walls as it wears down. And then another thing you can see is taper. So also there'll be some more wear on. Usually, kind of a lot of times it kind of tapers down, but you can have a lot of different wear patterns just depending on. I think a lot of different things, but taper and out of roundness are very important measurements when you're looking at the bore. So usually every engine will have a spec for this. If you go to your the full service manual for that vehicle and engine, they'll have all these specs kind of listed out. They'll have the nominal spec, as well as the kind of the low and the high value, and then usually there'll be a service limit as well. So there'll be a spec that you want to stay within, but then there'll be also a service limit where maybe you could be you can be past the where they want you to be, kind of low and high, and it'll be okay. But then there'll be a service limit where you need to you have to fix it or service it past that point. So so the bore will have a specific spec, but that's going to be more based on ultimately based on your desired piston to cylinder wall clearance, which we'll get into. But then there's also that out of roundness and the taper. So in order to get those numbers, basically for taper, usually it recommends measuring 3 different portions of the cylinder. So you're the bottom, the middle, and the top. And then you're also going to measure for your out of roundness. You're going to measure 2 positions, basically the X and the Y of the circle, to get those 2 measurements. So based on those, you'll get your out of roundness by getting the X and the Y measurement within that circle, and then getting the 3, the top, middle, and bottom, you get your taper. So
yeah, and I guess
those will tell you. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, like, to paint a picture in your head, the way you're measuring this is the diameter, right? So you measure straight across your cylinder, and even if it's out of round to the eye, it'll probably still look pretty circular. So, just one end to the other, and then you turn your measurement device 90 degrees. And then that's how you're measuring these 2, X and Y, right? It's just relative to each other, this 90 degrees. Though you should orient one of those, as Brian mentioned, to that plane that, your rod is moving in. And then obviously you just do that at 3 different places. But I guess just to kind of illustrate in the mind, since we're just talking, right? We don't have any images to show of what that looks like or how you're measuring that. So when you measure that diameter, you get a number, which should be the diameter of the circle. But hey, look at that. You have 2 different numbers. Your cylinder is shaped like an egg. So congratulations.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, the egg shaping is pretty common, and that's going to be one of your areas where you're gonna, if it gets too bad, you're gonna have maybe excessive oil burn, because some of that's gonna sneak through those oval areas, and then also just less compression, less more leakage. So it to be able to figure out if your engine has that problem, the easiest way is with a compression test. So there's usually kind of a spec for whatever the engine's compression ratio and maybe even displacement too. But basically, there'll be a number range that you can expect to see. Maybe it's like 200 psi or so. It's usually somewhere around there, depending on the engine. Maybe more for a high compression one. But if those numbers are low, it could be the rings. And then usually one way people kind of check that is if you get a low value and then you put some oil down into the cylinder and it goes up, that usually means that it's a ring issue. So that's kind of the one way to find that out. Another way you can also do a leak down test, which the difference there is, so the compression test, you're just hooking the gauge up to the spark plug hole, and you're running the starter to just spin the engine without, make sure it doesn't start up by pulling the fuel pump relay or fuse or ignition fuse, or I guess you don't want fuel spraying in there, so you want to disable fuel, and then you just let the engine pump up several rotations until it usually gets to a maximum value, and you record that. Whereas a leak down test, it hooks up to the same area, but you pressurize the cylinder, and then basically it's measuring at 100 psi. Usually, I think is what they spec or recommend for the gauges, but basically it's measuring a kind of airflow, but then the gauge records it as a percentage loss, basically. So if if your all cylinders are at like 3%, you're looking pretty good, because there's always going to be some leakage. Nothing can leak, or nothing could usually seal perfectly, even especially when it's cold. If you're just doing an engine on a stand or something,
right? Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect fits in the real world, and then you also consider that you're not pumping oil through, right, which helps that seal right around the piston ring, and you're not going to get 100%.
Yeah, there's already gaps, like we'll get into piston ring gaps, but there's gaps in the piston rings, so ultimately there's some air going to leak through there. But like some 2 to 3%, you're looking really good. That's usually like a fresh rebuild is what you'll see there. But if you're starting to get the 6, okay, it's a little more tired. 9, okay, that's not the best. And then usually once you get into double digits, that starts to be concerning. So what's good about the leak down test is it's testing both kind of that ring seal, but also your valve seals, how well the valves are sealing. So it's leak down is better for identifying kind of those valve related issues, and especially if the engine's out and just on like a stand, it's very easy. And even when it's not out, honestly, you can kind of listen for where the air's leaking into. You can put your head up to like the intake manifold or the exhaust manifold, and if you hear it coming out there, then it's an exhaust valve issue, intake valve issue, that kind of thing. So
has anybody ever used one of those like knock stethoscopes to try and hear where their leak is coming from?
I don't know. I mean, you could probably use just a regular stethoscope, maybe. But yeah, that could be interesting.
There you go.
Because sometimes it can be tricky. Oh, Pat, just buy a bunch of doctor stethoscopes and then sell them for twice as much.
3 times as much, probably. This is motorsports we're talking about.
Yeah, racing leak down tester, sound amplifier.
This is the leak down audible locator Engine-O-Matic 2000. I don't know.
Yeah, it could work. Although usually medical stuff is already kind of expensive for what it is. But I guess racing is another level sometimes.
It is. Yeah, we might just have to go down to 2x of the cost, since medical is already pretty crazy.
Yeah. But yeah, so leak down and compression, those are going to be your main tools for kind of determining engine health and kind of what to look at. So But anyway, going back to the measurement side and the building side. So if any of those, if those, if your taper or your out of roundness is out of spec, really the only way to solve that is an overbore. Most of the time, the minimum you'll really see is a 10 over. So that's 10 thousandths, or I guess 1/100th of an inch overbore. 20 over is usually the common you'll find in like when you're ordering pistons from, say, like an aftermarket supplier. 20 over is kind of the common size I see. And then some blocks, sometimes they'll have a limit to how many times you could bore it. So it depends on what you're going for. If you want maximum displacement and power, then you want to bore it as much as you can. But if you're looking at maybe looking ahead and you want to be able to rebuild that engine again, you might want to leave it to the minimum overbore you can get away with, so that then the next time, as long as you don't, throw a rod through the block or anything, next time you go to rebuild, you can then just do another overbore to get it right back in line. So,
right. Yeah, you don't want to run out of material, right?
Yes. Yeah, and one area I saw some engine builders doing, especially when they're trying to push stock blocks towards super high horsepower levels, is they will check the basically the thickness of the bores to the next bore, and as well as like the water jackets, and then based on those measurements, you can actually offset bore those cylinders in order to basically increase the overall, or at least effectively minimize that reduction in thickness that you're getting. That starts to get a little more advanced. I mean, there's usually some play on the crankshaft with the rod that you can get away with a slight offset bore, but most of the time, most people aren't really going to worry about that.
If you're doing that though, wouldn't that give you an egg shape? Because you're only it's offset, and then you're going to go for a larger bore. So then that area that's smaller that you're not cutting into should now give you this ovular shape, right?
I mean, ultimately, if you're doing an offset bore, you're limited to, you can only do a very slight adjustment there, because you still need to, it's an overbore, so you're still taking out material as long as the new circle is at least tangent with the edge of the last circle.
Yeah, so
then you'll still be okay.
Diameter, which is larger, but is now shifted, is tangent to the original.
Yes.
Okay.
If that's like your limit there. If you go any further, then you're gonna have some weird nub kind of the old bore sticking out.
Okay.
So it's definitely, that's more on the advanced side. I've never messed with anything like that. That's more on the place I've seen that is like people building 2JZs for drag racing classes where they can't like use billet blocks, and basically they'll get like 4 blocks in and measure the thicknesses of everything, since the castings can be a little different from block to block. So they'll find the perfect one, then offset bore it perfectly, and that's how they're going to get it to survive at 4,000 horsepower. Maybe not that much, but a lot for sure. But yeah, that's not super common, but I thought it was kind of interesting when I learned about it. But yeah, I mean, that kind of covers your cylinder bores. So I guess we can transition to pistons, since kind of determining that bore size, also like the final bore size. So when we say 20 over, that's going to be 20 thousandths over the nominal spec, but there's still going to be a little bit of a range there, because you're going to ultimately target a piston to cylinder wall clearance.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be affected by a lot of things. If you're just going with a stock replacement piston, then there's going to be a spec there from the manufacturer that you're going to want to follow. But if you're going with aftermarket pistons that maybe are a different material, so most Most factory engines come with a cast aluminum piston. Some of them, the more modern engines, come with hyperteutonic. I can never pronounce it correctly, but it's just a different. It's I believe it has more silicon in it. Silicon.
Silicon. I
There's
think it's silicon.
silicon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which basically it makes it so it doesn't expand as much under heat. So they're able to run much tighter cylinder to piston clearances with a hyperteutonic piston, which helps in the OEM world with blow by and emissions and that kind of thing, and kind of keeping the engine a little quieter when it's warming up too. You can get some piston slap when you have super high clearances where it's kind of rocking around with while it warms up until it warms up and has a nice seal. You might get a little louder kind of engine noise. It's not exactly as loud as a Rodnock, but it's you can hear it.
Yeah.
But that's only common on your next type of piston, which is your kind of aftermarket forged aluminum piston, which are usually going to be it's a 2000 series alloy. I forget the exact numbers, but that's your strongest. That's going to be your strongest piston material, but it's going to also expand the most compared to the other kind of available alloys. And because of that, you need a higher clearance, especially for super high performance engines that are going to have high cylinder temperatures. They're going to expand a lot more.
So, but when you refer to temperature with that 2000 series, and you say it's going to expand more, you mean compared to what else is used currently for pistons, right?
Yeah.
Not all aluminums, right?
Yes.
Because many years back, people made aluminum brake rotors, right? And they used 2024 because it was the most stable at temperature. So I guess I just want to make sure I'm getting that right. It's gonna, what you're talking about is gonna change more compared to these fancy new pistons, but not necessarily compared to like a 6061 that you'd find on just about anything, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the common alloy is a 2618, which is very low silicon. So it's less than 0.25%. Whereas I forget what the hyperteutonic pistons have, but I think it's over 10%, I believe. There's also in the aftermarket, sometimes you can find 4032, which has higher silicon as well, which is going to be better for having a tighter cold clearance. But again, it's not as strong, especially at those, I believe, at those higher temperatures than 2618, which is going to be like where you're going to get from Weisco or Manley or any of those kind of aftermarket piston brands. So you combine that, a piston expands more than your kind of OEM piston with, if you're planning a very high performance engine build that's going to be just have a lot of heat from just a lot of power. One of the losses in the combustion cycle is going to be that heat. As we kind of talked about that in the hybrid, I believe the kind of engine efficiency, hybrid efficiency, that kind of thing. Heat is one of the byproducts, and the more power you make, the more heat you're going to have in general. So that's going to mean that piston is going to expand even more. So that's when you start getting into, usually the piston manufacturers will have a recommendation based on kind of power, the type of power adders you're going to be using, nitrous, turbos, superchargers, that sort of thing. They'll recommend a piston to cylinder wall clearance. So ultimately the piston, when you buy it, is going to be a certain size. So you're going to change that clearance through the bore. So when you get your pistons, you're going to measure at the skirt. Usually the manufacturer will kind of usually in their literature they'll have where that you should measure on the skirt. You're going to get that diameter, and then based on that, you're going to measure all your pistons, and then your engine builder and your machinist will then match the bores to the desired piston to cylinder wall clearance. So based on that, that should get your bore right where you need it. So from there, I guess since we're on piston, we could go into piston rings.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of your next thing to worry about. So most pistons have, I mean, it's kind of 3 rings, but the oil ring is going to be made up of 3 parts. But so you basically have your top compression ring, your second compression ring, and then your oil ring, which is made up of 3 rings. But basically the top compression ring, that's going to be the one that's doing the first job of the sealing. You're going to have your second compression ring, which is there kind of as a backup and to again improve your sealing. And some super fancy ultra like Formula One engines and stuff will just have, maybe not Formula One, they might only have 1 ring, but I think some of the super crazy high strung like naturally aspirated drag engines, they'll just do a single ring just to cut down on the friction losses. I forget if that's drag racing guys or if maybe F1, but anyway, I've seen it where they only have 1 compression ring.
Okay.
And then your oil ring, that's going to be the one that's going to scrape. Basically, it's scraping the oil off of the cylinder as the piston comes down, so that there's not a bunch of oil within the combustion chamber when it's
Combusting.
When it's combusting, because there's going to be oil sprayed. Basically, there's oil that comes from the rod bearing journal through the rod into that oil is the pin, the wrist pin of the piston. So that's going to kind of spray all over the place. And then also some is then also lubricating the cylinder wall, because obviously you want to lubricate the piston.
Mm-hmm.
So what that ring is doing is scraping that oil off, and then also kind of applying it at the same time. It's kind of hard to explain, but ultimately it's preventing that oil from getting into the combustion process, but it's also helping distribute that oil to the piston itself. So like I said, it's made out of 3 pieces. It's just made of 2 thinner rings than the compression rings. And then there's kind of a spring, kind of ring in between that just holds them up together. So those 2 oil rings are going to do the 2 smaller oil rings held up by the kind of center spring ring is going to then do that scraping job. So when you're building the engine, I mean, the piston, if you're getting aftermarket piston, will come with rings. Otherwise, you'll order them separately for like an OEM piston, or maybe separately from aftermarket ring supplier like Hastings. But you know, they're gonna be the right thickness and everything. You don't have to worry about that. It's mainly the gap is what you're going to be concerned with. So obviously, I think gapless rings exist. I forget, again, this might be like a Formula One thing or something.
Sounds crazy to me.
But I believe they exist. But from any normal engine build today, you're going to have a gap. So,
Right.
in order to get the ring onto the piston, there needs to be a gap there, as well as there needs to be a gap there to allow for heat expansion.
Right. So this is now no longer a continuous circle. Right. We've just cut it. So it's sort of C-shaped, except that gap is now, the gap that determines you have a C instead of an O is incredibly small, but it's not continuous anymore. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what you're going to do is you're going to get your piston ring and you're going to put it in the cylinder bore. You're going to press it down with the piston to get it, make sure it's square within the bore. And then you're going to get a feeler gauge, and you're going to check that gap. And so the manufacturer of the ring will usually have, and a lot of times it's the same as the piston that you got, that it'll come with rings. But basically, the manufacturer will have a recommendation for what this gap should be based on several different factors. A lot of times, it's again going to be kind of horsepower based or power adder based. Like we talked about with forced induction, those engines can run a lot hotter. So that's usually means you're going to need a larger gap there. I believe nitrous engines also need, they run very, very hot. They need a lot big gap there too.
Right.
But I mean, in road racing, I haven't really seen anyone use nitrous. Time Attack, I've seen nitrous.
Yeah.
But basically, if you're just turbo and nitrous and making over 1,000 horsepower, you're going to probably need a pretty big gap there. Relatively, I mean, we're still talking thousandths of an inch, but but yeah, but you'll need to increase that gap. So you'll want to increase that gap by a lot of times. I'd recommend that they make specific little filing tools for it. That kind of, it basically has a little crank handle and a little mini disc that you can then use to file. I wouldn't use like a bench grinder or a cutoff wheel or something like that. You can use just sandpaper, but it's a little hard to get an exact kind of flat cut there. Ultimately, you will want to deburr after you do your filing. So with either a small file or a little bit of sandpaper, just quickly make sure deburr those edges so that you're not going to scratch the cylinder walls. But yeah, once you get to the right gap, then you're good there. And then usually it'll be kind of in the piston instructions, but you're going to want to space the ring gaps specifically. Usually your top ring is going to be in some orientation, maybe not super important. I think maybe it needs to not be along the skirt axis. I'm not 100% sure, but usually there's going to be a recommendation for the manufacturer. But then the next gap, the second compression ring, is going to want to be 180 degrees away from that. So basically trying to space the gaps out as far as possible to prevent leakage. And then finally, the oil rings will also usually have a gap as well, and they're going to be kind of 90 degrees from that second ring, and then the final little oil ring will be 180 degrees from the last oil ring. So basically you have 4 separate gaps now, but they're all spaced kind of 90 degrees from each other as you kind of go down in a spiral. So again, that's just to prevent, trying to minimize that leakage that you're going to get since you have gaps there.
Right. Now,
but
the potential requirement for adjusting it is also dependent, I guess, on the architecture of the engine, right? And when I say architecture, I don't mean just generic layout, but as we all know, there's lots of parts that go into an engine, and they have different characteristics. I guess what I'm getting at is, if you see someone do a relatively small shot of nitrous in a LS, or a Gen 1, like a 350, an old, your grandpa's 350. Like, one of the first things all those guys will do is increase that gap. And whether that's just sort of a garage mechanic, like they all think they need to, so maybe they don't, but they do. I mean, that's definitely a possibility, but then, you'll see some 4 cylinders where, okay, it's naturally aspirated. I slapped a turbo on it. I'm over doubling the power, and I still don't actually need to increase this gap size. So is it true that it's going to be different depending on the engine? Like, you can't just say like a percentage-based power increase requires this much change. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean,
because if I can over double the power on one
mean,
engine and not need it, but then add 50 horsepower to a 350 horsepower engine and need to do it, I mean, that's definitely not percentile based.
I mean, part of that's going to be like kind of your power per cylinder, right? So if you're doing a V8 versus a 4-cylinder, adding 100 horsepower to that four cylinder is going to be 25 horsepower per cylinder versus adding 100 to that V8 is going to be, what's that? Like 8 point something per cylinder.
12.5.
No, sorry. Sorry. And,
But
so yeah, it's going to be a much,
I mean,
it's going to be a much different on the V8, right? Or less.
yeah, exactly though. But I mean, that's what I'm getting at, right? Is if the V8, as far as I'm aware, like all signs point to it should be less. It should be able to handle the power adder better, but at least with LS, right? I don't know the ins and outs of every V8. I'm not trying to pretend I do. But increasing that gap seems to be incredibly common. And that's at a point where, even power per cylinder, your percent increase is incredibly small compared to your four cylinder,
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that could also be the size of the rings. The different pistons and different engines and manufacturers are going to spec different kind of size rings and everything. So that's gonna affect that change in gap with temperature, the material, the ring. There's a couple different options for those. I think I've seen, different steels and everything. So I think it's just, some engines, the way they were designed originally, maybe the stock piston rings are, super thin, or some other super thick boys, and just require, they just have different expansion rates per horsepower, sort of.
Sure.
And then it could also be a factor of cooling and just resistance to knock, and how much ignition timing it can run before knock, and that kind of same thing there. But so yeah, I mean, it's gonna, I mean, honestly, if ideally you could run a thermal simulation on your piston ring based on some temperatures you measured within your cylinder, and that would determine the optimal ring gap for the maximum horsepower that you're going to see or something. But for the rest of us, it's just kind of going along with the recommendations, and maybe people have done it before. So I don't know how much power you're going to lose from an extra 5/1000ths of an inch ring gap. I couldn't tell you. I haven't. So the way, I guess, the way you'd find out that you went too tight would be most likely a ringland failure. If that ring binds up, it's going to probably cause the piston, or basically where that ring is sitting in the piston, it probably is going to cause that to break, and then basically cause a pretty major engine failure. So
Yeah.
but that could also just be you get a lot of knock and it causes the piston to fail at the ring lane, which is kind of a stress riser on the piston, edge of the piston there. So
Right.
If you have a ringland failure, you might think, oh, it's my gap, but it could also just be knock. So
Sure. Yeah, those Jabronskis over at Engine Masters, who are pretty much deal exclusively with junkyard crate 350s. So I guess they're not crates, but junkyard 350s. That's what they talk about when they see ringland failures, or ring failures anyway, is that they heat up so much. I mean, they're throwing a lot of NOS at it, but they heat up so much that the ring closes that gap. And then you just have this trapped volume that's still trying to thermally expand. And you get a pretty serious failure.
Yeah, so going a little looser definitely won't hurt you. Just a little bit of power loss, whereas going too tight is going to be bad. So it's definitely good to err on the side of a little bit more. But again, like, it's something that if you're building over, I think really experienced engine builder that has built 500 350s that make 500 horsepower, and so they're going to know, oh, one time we tried to go tight and it blew up, so we went a little looser, it didn't blow up, and so that's one way to learn. Of course, I'm sure OEMs are doing all this analysis, and or at least their suppliers, the piston suppliers, doing all this analysis to determine the optimal ring gap, and then of course for them, they're more worried about like the tolerances of manufacturing and how tight they can keep it within there, not as much how tight they can get it on the actual gap, but more how close they can keep that through making thousands of engines. But anyway, I guess one thing I forgot to talk about real quick before we go too far is measuring the bore. There's a couple different measurement tools you can use, as well as the measuring that piston diameter to get that piston to cylinder wall clearance. I mean, so for the ring gap, the feeler gauge is really all I've seen used. So that's kind of the tool for the job there. But for a cylinder bore, honestly, the best tool for the job is a dial bore indicator. I mean, you can get digital ones, I guess. It doesn't have to be a dial, but a bore indicator, whether it's digital or dial. I honestly like the dial ones because I don't know, it's kind of easier for me to read. It's the numbers are kind of jump around on a digital one, whereas you can see exactly where that dial is moving and where you can see it as you're rocking it in the bore to get that maximum measurement. You can see it get to the maximum and then overshoot, and then come back down. It kind of goes up and down, and so it's easy to see right where you get it. And honestly, usually the dial ones are cheaper than the digital.
All my measurement tools are dial, because I
mean,
what you just described, and they're also not going to run out of battery.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just,
I do like digital calipers.
Dude.
Scrub I've used dial ones too. So I've seen people use. So there's I forget exactly what they're called, but there's these little like kind of telescoping bore gauges that you
like the spring
put down in the
thing.
bore. Yeah, it spring loads out and gets that measurement, or gets that distance. You pull it out and then you measure it with either a caliper or hopefully a micrometer.
Right.
And that's how you get your bore. The problem I have with those is it's like you have no way to tell, like I said, when you're rocking the dial bore indicator in the bore and it's getting up to that maximum point and then coming back down. You have no way to determine if you reach that point with one of those telescoping spring-loaded measures. So you could spring it out, boom, pull it out, but as you pull it out, you might rock it slightly, and then it expands a little bit, or
so that spring-loaded action, as soon as you take it off of perpendicular from the bore axis, you might actually measure larger than what it actually is.
Yes.
Right. So
yeah, and sorry, I think I misspoke earlier with the dial indicator. It's more finding that minimum bore size, because that's your ultimate measurement. I think I was saying maximum earlier. So yeah, if so, as you're pulling that telescoping gauge out, I mean, it's supposed to like it spring loads out, and I think you can like lock it down, but there's no way of telling if you got it exactly on that point.
Right. I mean,
so as you pull it out.
So even if you have it locked before you pull it out, the thing is, when you're locking it, like when it is in the bore, you have no gauge to like see how perpendicular it is, so that, and then, I mean, when we're talking, 1/1000th of an inch, it's a very small angle change, has a huge impact on what you're measuring, know? So it's not something I like to do there specifically. Just because you can't repeatedly tell that, like, you're shoving this measurement tool in by hand. You're not fixturing it in any way. It's not sweet.
Yeah. So you're introducing error there, with that, as it springs out and you lock it down. But then also you're adding an extra amount of error by now having to measure that with your micrometer. Hopefully, the caliper can't really, unless you get really, really expensive ones. I mean, for the most part, they're going to be within 5 thousandths, but that's not going to be enough. You need a micrometer, which is going to be on the 10 thousandths range. I guess as I've seen them, I guess calipers I've seen, sorry, on the half a thou,
Half a
at least.
tenth, right? So I guess I don't know about the plus or minus on the caliper themselves, but most of them read out to the thousandth of an inch.
Yes.
And some digital ones have a half after that.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be a half of a 10,000th.
Yes. Or 5/10,000ths.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, but a micrometer is going to go down to the 10,000th.
Yeah.
Which is, because it's not only what it can measure, but it's also that accuracy. And a lot of times, calipers, they'll be advertised within the 10,000th of an inch accuracy. So, but of course, it depends on how you use it too. You can be very inaccurate too. So,
right.
if you don't get that, micrometer perfectly on that spring loaded gauge, and maybe it compresses in just a little bit as you're putting the micrometer on it, because you're applying a little bit of pressure as you're dialing it in. It usually has that little knob that kind of clicks when you're there, but that still puts some pressure on it. So it's just introducing a lot of extra error, which again, when we're trying to measure within thousandths and 10 thousandths of an inch,
this all matters.
You can't really afford it. It's the difference between being an out around spec or having it be okay and thinking you need to overbore or whatever in order to fix that. So
and I mean, a lot of these spring loaded gauges we're talking about too. Have rounded edges, which is very understandable. That's how you touch 2 points, rather than if you had a flat, you wouldn't actually be able to, the two edges of the flat would interfere before you're actually getting that measurement. So that's the way it should be shaped. But on that note, when you're trying to measure it when it's out of the cylinder bore, now you're trying to hold a mic or calipers, preferably a mic, right, up to 2 rounded faces. And now you're trying to make sure that mic is at the furthest distance it can be between those 2, points. It's just, we're throwing in a lot of headache here. So
yeah. So those aren't my favorite. Ultimately, a dial bore gauge, which anytime you go to an engine builder or a machine shop or whatever, that's what you're going to see them using. So our recommendation is, if you're planning to build and blueprint a lot of engines, to go out and buy a nice set of dial indicators. Again, if you get some Amazon, China junk, you might as well just not bother. I don't think you have to buy the most expensive. You can find online. There's usually a good middle ground. I mean, I've seen like Fowler, although made in China, they have some decent stuff.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know. But I would, for engine stuff, I would ball out or just not do it. My calipers are decent enough for making parts, where I need a tolerance of under 5 thou, but I'm not trying to do this. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I guess
to Midatoyo,
I guess I found with
for this.
Yes, and so I personally have Midatoyo dial bore gauges. I balled out, and I really like them. They're very, very nice. And I do have Fowler micrometers. So what I ended up doing is taking it into, when we're working at Pratt Miller, they would, assuming we'd be using these for work, which, every once in a while I would, but they would let you once a year go in and have basically they would calibrate. So, they would have all their calibrated standards, 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, they're all exactly, within a thousandth of an inch, the exact dimension. So then you measure that, and that tells you if if it's measuring accurately. So they'd check it to that, and then they'd zero, or they'd zero out the micrometer, and they were able to calibrate it. So that means is accurate enough to pass their calibration. So, but again, obviously, not everyone has access to a quality group that'll do that. So, but it worked for me. So, because though I was able to get away with because there was a big increase from the Fowler to the Mitutoyo micrometers. So I tried to see if I could find that middle ground there, and it seems to have worked. Because part of the problem there, though, is when you're setting so usually what you do with a dial bore gauge is you set a micrometer to the bore, basically the expected bore size, or the nominal spec of the bore, and then you zero your dial indicator to that, and then based on that, then you put in the bore, and you kind of get your differential measurement to a certain number that you set the micrometer to. So ultimately, if your micrometers aren't accurate, then your dial bore gauge won't be accurate, because you're setting it based off of that dimension on the micrometer. So that's kind of a caveat to look out for. If you buy crappy micrometers and using a dial bore gauge, you're kind of defeating the purpose of. So basically, the alternative to all of this, of balling out on super nice Starrett, Mitutoyo, measurement tools, is to just have your machinist do the measurements. They will usually do them for you if you ask. Of course, there's going to be some sort of hourly rate there.
Mm-hmm. But if you're not trying to make this your hobby, I mean, not racing, but specifically engine building, 1 to 2 rebuilds is paying someone is probably going to end up being cheaper, right?
Oh yeah. So that's, if you're not planning to do a lot of engines, then definitely, and have them take care of it. And just what I've done in the past is, when I drop an engine off, I try to, for the measurements they're going to take, and for the ones there's certain ones they're going to have to take no matter what, because of say the piston or cylinder wall clearance. You're going to want to give them the pistons so they can measure them, and then they're going to do the bore, bore out your block, and they're going to obviously need to measure that to make sure they bored it out to the correct dimension. So they're going to have all those measurements. So what I've done is give them basically this kind of printout sheet that has all the dimensions I'm looking for, little blank boxes for them to put the numbers in, nice and easy. So I found that was good, so they didn't have to write it on some napkin or something, give it to you. It's all set up so they can just quickly put the numbers in and make it easier on them. So yeah, I mean, so if you want to be serious with this, you're going to want a nice set of dial bore gauges and a nice set of micrometers. For your dial bore gauges, you're going to want sizes, because there's usually a range that each one can measure. You're also going to want sizes small enough to do the rod and main journals for the bearings, in order to get kind of much more accurate measurements there too. Which there are also some alternatives there to measure that. I guess we could just get right into it. So we've covered bores, we covered the pistons, we covered the rings.
Yeah, but still on the bottom end, we got those bearings.
So now on the bottom end, we have bearings. So you have your main bearings, which are what support the crankshaft, and then your rod bearings, which are supporting the rods. Mm-hmm. So, and if we're starting from the main,
just super simple. Mains connect the crank to the block. Rods connect the rods to the crank. Right?
Yes. Yeah. So, and the crankshaft's riding on just an oil bearing, or kind of a journal bearing, which we kind of described when we're talking about turbos. But journal bearing, it's mainly just a kind of a softer. It'll be a softer metal, and then an oil film, and then so the oil is coming through. Usually, there's a hole within that journal that goes through the bearing, and then oils the bearing itself, and then that the crankshaft or rod will then ride on that oil film, and then ultimately that softer metal bearing is there in order to, if for some reason you don't have a strong film there, it'll at least prevent it from touching down kind of steel to steel and just creating huge gashes immediately. It'll wear the bearing instead of the nice machine metal parts that determine those clearances. So the bearing is there to protect the good stuff, the block itself. Because if you were to touch down and wear completely through the bearing, which obviously happens when usually referred to as spinning a bearing, basically you wear it down enough that it loses its hold base. There's usually these two little tangs that hold the bearing in place. If you get it thin enough, it'll just it'll cause the bearing to spin within the journal, and it'll just and then the bearing itself will just start to disintegrate, and eventually you just have metal to metal contact. And once you destroy those journal surfaces where the bearing sits, either you can repair, but a lot of times you can potentially junk the block and definitely the crank. Bearings are super important, and determining that bearing clearance to the journal is also very important. So one way you can do this is with plastic gauge. It's kind of probably one of the more popular ways that you'll see people doing it. It can be accurate. I've seen some, YouTube videos. They're super accurate and never false YouTube videos of people trying out plastic gauge multiple times, and then also doing dial bore gauge measurements. And a lot of times they'll find that they do a pretty good job of staying consistent. I would say, if you're just doing a stock rebuild of your daily driver or whatever, I think plastic gauge is perfectly fine. But if you're trying to make a super high-strung race engine and you need those bearing clearances really accurate and tight, or because you're trying to run 0W20 oil to have the least amount of power loss possible and all that kind of stuff, then you're going to want the most accurate tools you can get. So basically the bearing clearance, again, this is something that there'll be an OE spec that if you're just building to stock or very close to stock power levels, you're just going to follow that spec. There's going to be a range and then a service limit. But if you're going kind of big turbo mega power, that's when you're going to probably want to go outside of that spec. Basically you'll go big, usually, with the idea being the larger that clearance is, the more oil film you can get, and so it'll kind of add an extra cushion for high horsepower per cylinder engine. But that's more common on your like big drag racing engines, or your 1,000 horsepower 4-cylinders, or 2,000 horsepower 2JZs and that kind of stuff. So maybe not as important especially for like a road racing build. You're going to want to you basically want to stay to the spec. And then you're going to tailor it towards your desired oil. So I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. One way to change your oil pressure within the engine, that kind of the inherent oil pressure, is by adjusting those clearances. If you go really big, it's going to lower your oil pressure because it promotes more flow and less pressure loss. And then if you reduce those clearances, it's going to increase your oil pressure. And then you can adjust your oil pressure through the weight of the oil as well. So if you're trying to run a really thin oil, then you're going to want to run tighter bearing clearances. But of course, there's a limit to how tight you can go before you start causing issues. So, but yeah, I mean, basically the way that's usually the way I prefer to measure that bearing clearance is you use a micrometer to measure that journal size. And again, you're going to want to measure in two spots, kind of along an X and a Y axis, basically. So, you measure one point and then 90 degrees from that, measure that again. You get those two diameters because, again, outer roundness is going to be a spec on the crankshaft as well as the cylinder bores. So you're going to want to check that, make sure it's not out of round, because that can create some problems, and you're going to need to get the crank either polished or potentially reground if it's out of spec. And then once you get that measurement, you then get your dial bore gauge with the bearings installed, and if you're doing the rods or the mains, basically we need those bearing caps torqued to spec. And then you measure that diameter, and then you have your pin, your journal side, or your kind of the crank pin or the main pin, basically the main journal pin or the rod pin. You have those diameters. You have your bearing outer diameter, and by subtracting the bearing diameter from the pin diameter, you have your clearance, and then you compare that to the spec. So again, you can use plastic gauge for this, but I mean, if you're already balling out for some dial indicators, or you might as well get the correct ones for your bearing sizes too. So that can be very important there. One kind of bonus measurement that I think I haven't really seen, at least specifically when I was building a 4G63, one of the concerns was the side clearance of the rod to the side of the crank journal. Basically, it was too tight on some engines, specifically for a 4G63 for Mitsubishi, at least for really high horsepower and kind of bigger rod bearing clearances. By not having enough side clearance, basically it couldn't let the oil flow through that bearing and out the sides of the rod fast enough, and could cause some issues there. So that's something to maybe look out for if you're building higher horsepower kind of engines. I'm not sure if it's as applicable to other things other than 4G63s, but again, another interesting tidbit I learned while building one of those engines. So that gets us basically through the bottom end. So there's also, I guess, the last thing on the bottom end. So the top of the bottom end, and that's your deck, your cylinder deck. So there's going to be a flatness spec for that. How that's usually measured is with a straight edge, and we're not talking like you just grab a ruler from the desk and you can slap it on there, or a piece of wood or a piece of scrap metal you've laying around. It's a straight edge will be a very specific. Basically, it looks like a ruler, but it has machined edges on the top and bottom, where they, perfectly, as well, not perfectly, but as to a certain tolerance, they flatten it. During the machining process of the straight edge, within a certain spec, and that makes it basically very close to perfectly flat. And then you put that on top of the deck, and then you do the same process for the cylinder head, sealing surface, but basically you put it on the deck, and then you get a feeler gauge, and you feel what the maximum thickness you can kind of fit in different spots along the cylinder head. So usually you measure kind of along the top of the cylinder head, cylinder blocker head, the bottom, the middle, and then you should do some like crosses as well to try to get as many places along it as possible. And again, there's going to be a spec for this, and as well as a service limit. Ideally, if you're planning to run a multi-layer steel head gasket and not like a normal, say, composite style one, you're going to want that to be super duper flat. Like there's like almost no margin for error there. So if you're planning to run one of those, which multi-layer steel gaskets are usually much better for higher horsepower, high boost, high cylinder pressures, you're going to want that. One, you're going to want to get it ground flat, but also the surface finish can also be important. But if you're just doing a kind of a stock rebuild with a standard OEM composite head gasket, then you don't have to be too concerned. You're mainly concerned with that flatness measurement with the feel gauges. So if you're able to stick in a feel gauge that's beyond the spec limit, then that means you're going to want to get that resurfaced at the machine shop. And then every head is going to, and usually block as well, is going to have a kind of grinding limit. So that's one other thing to look out for. If you just grind it all, because one way to kind of effectively increase your compression ratio is to grind off as much of the head and block as possible. You're basically making that the kind of the compression area, the quench zone in the cylinder head, the hemi dome, whatever you want to call it. You're making that effectively smaller, which changes the compression ratio. Which compression ratio is just the difference in volume between when the piston's all the way down and the piston's all the way up. So by changing, you're slightly changing when it's fully down, but you're kind of more greatly changing when it's fully up. But ultimately, it's reducing that ratio.
Well, it's increasing the ratio, right?
Sorry, yeah, increasing the ratio, reducing the volume, I guess, on the when it's all the way up, which is going to increase that ratio. So, so a lot of times some say in spec Miata, some engine builders will just grind it all the way down to the limit. But then, of course, if there's any problems with the head, there's no really bringing it back, because now you've ground it down to the limit where you're going to start getting into maybe water jackets and stuff like that. So ideally, you want to just grind it as much as basically you need to get it flat. But sometimes if you're going all out performance, you'll just grind it all down. But of course, you got to look out for the valve clearance and things like that. You can't just go crazy there. So, but that's probably a little more. That's maybe more for another day, talking about high performance cams and valve clearances and all that kind of stuff. Mainly just talking about getting your engine back to full running potential, or just assembling your performance engine. So, but anyway, so that gets most of the main measurements you're going to worry about on the bottom end. Certain engines, you're going to have specs for like the oil pump and things like that. But otherwise, I guess one quick thing, that the piston, sometimes there's a spec for like the piston, the wrist pin, the piston pin. But there's really not much I've ever seen done there. It should be in spec based on just the manufacturing tolerances. So there's really no added gap or anything I've ever seen. I guess the only thing to look out for is usually OEM pistons. Most of the time, the wrist pin is pressed into the rod, and then the piston itself is loose on it. Whereas kind of a fully floating pin, as they'll call it, in kind of aftermarket pistons and rods, basically the pin will float both on the rod itself and the piston, and due to that, there's an extra oiling journal on the small end of the rod in order to lubricate that pin, and that could just create. I'm not sure if it's exactly for performance. Honestly, I haven't really looked into it. It could just be for ease of them manufacturing those parts and not having to worry about a press fit, and it's easier for you to put them together. I imagine there's really no, if anything, you're adding an extra sliding portion, which I don't think is really a benefit, but mainly when you do performance pistons, the main thing is they'll give you a super beefy, thick pin, which is going to resist bending and be a lot stronger. So that's but a lot of times they'll be floating. But usually there's not really much you're going to change there. I guess check to make sure that it's not binding up, because if so, then you're probably going to want to return that piston to get that pin to get the correct part from the manufacturer. Okay, so that gets us through the bottom end. The top end, I'd say there's a lot of measurements you can do, but for your basic rebuild, not too much. Like I said, you're going to want to measure your head flatness, which is usually going to be where you're going to find the most warpage. Most engines nowadays, at least most older engines are going to be iron block aluminum head, with all the latest new engines being aluminum block aluminum head. So with aluminum blocks, you can definitely get some warpage there. But when it comes to iron block aluminum head, anytime you overheat the engine, a lot of times the warpage comes from the head side, since the aluminum's going to distort a bit more under heat than the cast iron. So yeah, making sure that's flat to get a good head gasket seal, very important. And then from there, I mean, you have your valve seats you're going to want to get reground. Usually there's just a basic kind of single angle cut done from the factory, and then you can go fancy at the machine shop doing a multiple angle valve job. Basically what that's doing is just kind of, it's going to reduce the kind of contact between the valve and the seat, which can reduce its kind of the seat's lifetime. But in a race engine, maybe not as important if you're rebuilding it often, especially with the high dollar pro engines. They're gonna not really care too much about replacing stuff. But what it will do then is basically it'll allow more air sooner through the valve opening as it opens by kind of minimizing that resistance, allowing the air to pass through easier as the valve starts to open. So that's where you can gain a little bit of performance doing a 3-angle or even 5-angle valve job, as they call them. Basically, it's just it's increasing, it's reducing the contact with the valve, and then kind of increasing that kind of taper on the transition between the cylinder head, intake ports, and exhaust ports, and the valve itself. So it's just promoting more airflow through there. So from there, if you need to grind the valve seats, as well as maybe grind down the valve itself to, a lot of times high mileage engines will have some almost like cupping or mushrooming of the valve. Basically it won't be flat anymore at the valve seat. You're going to want to get those valves ground down to that 45, usually it's a 45-degree angle, in order to mate with at least the middle angle of your 3 or 5-angle valve job, or single angle, in order to get a good seal there. If you're not getting your valve seats ground, lapping can be done to solve a lot of sealing issues. So basically you're just putting a abrasive compound on the valve, and then you're pushing it up against the valve seat and just using the valve itself to basically kind of remachine that valve seat to mate better with the valve. If you're doing a fresh valve grind and valve seat grind, then you don't need to do that. It should be perfect, from the machine shop. But if you're not, then lapping can help. If you do some valve seat grinding, it's going to change the height basically it's going to reset that valve into the cylinder head, which is going to change basically where the retainer ends up for the valve spring, which is going to basically extend the valve spring. It'll make your valve spring installed height longer, as well as change kind of that height of the valve tip to the rock arm, or whatever the geometry of your cylinder head valve train is. So potentially you're going to need to grind down the valve a little bit to correct that difference, as well as now you're going to need to potentially shim your valve seats in order to get your valve spring installed height within spec. So again, another thing to look out for. That one can be a little difficult to measure. In my experience, basically I've taken not exactly welding rod, but something a little thicker, and measured it to the correct, basically cut it down and sanded it down to the correct height, and then use that as kind of a gauge. Basically, you install the valve seat or the valve spring uh, retainer. You install it on there without a valve spring. By you kind of tap you put it roughly on the valve, and then basically pull the valve through the valve guide, and kind of tap it in to seat the valve, the keepers along with the valve spring seat, and then you measure that distance between the machine to kind of service where it sits. Usually there's like a separate valve seat piece that you put in there. So you measure that distance. Effectively, you're measuring where the spring would be, and then you shim the valve seat accordingly in order to get that correct height. Because at the worst case, you have no preload on your valve spring there, so any sort of air in the intake manifold can almost basically press it open, especially with boost. But usually it's not going to be that bad. It's just going to be, you're just going to want the correct preload that the manufacturer set on the valve spring for correct kind of wear, as well as valve spring performance, basically. So I guess one thing you could do is shim it a little tighter to add some more preload, but then you just have to worry about binding up that spring. So you just need to know at the maximum valve lift, as long as you're not bottoming out that spring, you're okay. There's other things you can measure, like your valve guide diameters. Those are so small, I'm not exactly sure what you'd use to measure those, because we're talking a couple millimeters. So
probably just plug gauges,
sure there's
right?
certain, I think there are some gauges you can get. Yeah, you could just do pin gauges, or I think I have seen some. They're almost kind of like those spring-loaded gauges, but they're just like a little like ball detent thing that like pops out. But usually with those, I mean, if the engine is older, you're just going to want to replace your valve guides anyway. But you could measure with some like gauge pins. Kind of go no go gauges, basically, in order to determine if you need to replace those. A lot of times I find that it's not super necessary. The more important thing is usually your valve stem seal, but no machining is really needed for that. That's just replacing that part. And then from there, I mean, that's kind of everything. You're usually not going to measure, say, your camshaft journals or anything like that. If you need to repair those, it's pretty hard to. Some shops will do it, but it's not a common repair. I guess the last thing, which I actually missed on the bottom end, is crankshaft end play. So that's usually going to be determined by there's going to be a thrust bearing somewhere on the crankshaft. Sometimes it's integral to one of the main journal bearings, but other times it'll be a separate piece. I think for a 4G63, it depends on the year, whether it's a 2-piece or a 3-piece, basically, or a 1-piece. I think Miatas have a 3-piece as well. It just depends on if it's a separate part, basically.
What is it on the crank walkie years of the 4G63?
Well, again, it depends on the year. The 7-bolt crank walking ones, I believe it is a 3-piece. And I think one of the problems might have been that bearing thickness or something. It's still like an urban legend exactly what causes crank walk. Some people just say it's just bad manufacturing tolerances. Other people say it's because everyone immediately puts a heavy duty clutch in their car and just causes a lot of extra kind of force, especially on startup when there's low oil pressure. Another theory I think is stuck open oil squirters that just cause low pressure in one of the bearings and cause it to spin. Just a lot of theories, but yeah, I believe it's a three piece on those 7 bolts. At least the later 7 bolts. Again, like it seems like they just kept changing it over and over again. Um, but anyway, basically your thrust bearing is what resists kind of the side to side clearance that the crankshaft can have, and that end play is going to be determined by the clearance from there's usually a machine surface on one of the crank journals to that thrust bearing. So most of the time you should be within spec as long as you replace that bearing and there's no extra wear on the crank. But it is one thing to check, and so you're going to need a dial indicator in order to check that. So basically, you're going to set it up on the end of the crank, and you're going to put a pry bar on it and just pry it one way, pry it the other way, and you're going to get that end play measurement. Too much can, of course, just cause issues with that. It could cause kind of binding with the rod. It could kind of close off that gap between the rod and the crank, which can cause oil issues. So definitely something important to look out for. But yeah, I think as far as kind of basic putting your engine together, I think that kind of covers everything. I kind of just kept rambling on and on there, but that's par for the course here at Motorsports Tech Talk.
That's right.
Yeah, is anything else you would like to add, Eric?
Oh, I don't think in this forum, not in this shorter rebuild section, you know.
Yeah, I guess one thing I just remembered is we talked about bore taper. You should also watch out for rod and main journal taper on the crankshaft too. Those can be important too. So again, you're just going to take 2 measurements from 2 points on that along the journal in order to get that, or at least a minimum of 2. So there's just ultimately basically go through the service manual for that engine and car, and it'll have all the specs that you need to do, and usually step by step, of course. That's what the manual's for, in order to measure all of those. So ultimately, if you like we said, if you're not looking to do a lot of engines, you can have your machinist or your engine builder do a lot of this. But if you're looking to do it yourself, or at least learn how it's done, that's basically we want to just go through everything we know of for building an engine. So we hoped it was helpful for you. As always, if you want to reach out to us, we have our social medias at Motorsports Tech Talk on Instagram, Facebook. Feel free to give us a follow or subscribe on our YouTube or Spotify, iTunes, all of that. But as always, thanks again for listening and sticking with us this long, and we hope to see you guys again soon.
See you.